Now, to frame this a little bit, I think we need to recognize just how badly the previous administration, and many others, but missed a reading of the signs of the times. And I'll just bring you back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was widely interpreted as a victory for us. Capitalism had triumphed. The United States had triumphed. Socialism and communism had failed. It was a unipolar moment, we were told, where one country now dominated the world and stood above it and could control it and dictate to it. This was expressed most poignantly, or most directly, in the Bush administration neoconservatives who dominated much of the administration's foreign policy, claiming essentially that the United States was now an unstoppable empire. Remember Ron Susskind, a journalist, reporting that he had had a conversation with a key White House official, largely believed to be Karl Rove, prior to the invasion of Iraq, in which Susskind said, if you invade Iraq, this is going to be a disaster. And the response that came back from this White House official was, oh, Ron, you live in what's called what we call the reality-based community. And he said, that's not the way the world works anymore. He said, we're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. Well, that gave rise to something I think some of you have heard me talk about, which was the neoconservatives actually laying out what they called America's grand strategy of how they could turn the military superiority of the United States, now that the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, into a kind of permanent global domination. And they said, well, all we have to do, and they laid it out in black and white, was invade Iraq and have a regime change there, take control of the world's oil supplies, dramatically increase U.S. military spending levels, even though our adversary had collapsed. They wanted to militarize space, to develop a new generation of usable nuclear weapons. It was a long series of very, very practical. They wanted to pull out of all international agreements that limited U.S. power because, again, they saw this as the unipolar moment. So their reading of history actually succeeded. They took advantage of that Kairos moment, but unfortunately for us in the world, they completely misread history. And what we're living with now, literally what we're living with now, is the consequences of that misreading. And we find ourselves in an accelerated now moment where, because of the errors of the past, which are rooted in much deeper things than just the last 8 years, let me be clear about that, but our time frame now is this really, really critical one. So we had a backlash, I think, in this last election. A backlash against some of this arrogance. A backlash against the fact that a lot of the stuff didn't unfold the way that was promised. And that's good news. Another piece of good news, and this is a good news that extends well beyond Barack Obama, and I would invite you to keep this in mind, that Barack Obama, one of the reasons he won was because he spoke about hope and change. And my reading of people around the country right now is that there is a deep, deep, deep desire for really meaningful change. Now the question, of course, and we can talk about this if you want to ask me a question about it, is Barack Obama in any kind of position to actually deliver the change that we need? And that's an open question. But for now, I just want to point out to you, I think the hopeful thing is how deep that desire is for something different. It needs to be cultivated, it needs to be acknowledged, it needs to be built on. But it is there. It is there, and it is one of the things that gives me reason for hope. Now let me just say one more thing about Barack Obama in a somewhat humorous way. Hope and change are words, and when there is a deep longing for change, it's very easy for us. This is my analogy. If any of you have ever been in a situation where you've been longing for a meaningful relationship and finding a significant other, Well, you meet someone and you go, wow, this is amazing. And you project everything that you possibly can want in a relationship onto this person. And then in about 2 or 3 weeks or a month, you start to realize, you know, she picks her nose. Whatever it is, it starts to get pulled back to reality. I think there's some of that going on. In other words, the longing that we have for change and hope is deeper than what we've projected onto Barack Obama. And we can't legitimately project onto someone else the hard work that we in fact need to do, which is to build foundations for authentic hope. So here we are in this really, really difficult place. And so far, I think I'm the only person who has named our dilemma in the way I'm about to name it, which makes me either, as Mel was saying, a bold thinker or crazy. And you can decide. But I recently wrote an op-ed piece that got edited down a little bit, but overall published in a reasonable form in the Duluth paper, because I can never get anything published in the local papers here. And it was published the Sunday before Barack Obama's inauguration. And what I said was this. I said that Barack Obama and our biggest challenge, which I don't think he'll name, but we need to name it, is that his greatest challenge, our greatest challenge, is to manage imperial decline. That's where we are. The Kairos moment, the moment of truth for us, is that we are living in an empire in inevitable decline. Now, that sounds so bleak on some hands, but I don't know. For me, I greet it with a sense of relief and possibility. Because what I want you to be thinking about is what it would mean for this nation, unlike most other empires in history, which is our challenge, to greet this as an opportunity and think about what that would mean. What would it mean for a country that has had an image of itself as the #1 power, who has overwhelmingly made the mistake of confusing military power with real strength, has undermined itself through decades and decades and decades of aggressive military spending, that ignored a Republican president who laid out the dangers of a military-industrial complex and just traveled down that road throwing gasoline on a fire, thinking that it could go on forever. And it can't. And it can't. So if our challenge is to manage imperial decline, then one of the things that we have to get the attention of any administration, including the current one, is to recognize that there are no military solutions to most or all of the problems that we face. There's no military solution to half the world's people living on less than $2 a day. There's no military solution to climate change. There's no military solution to our healthcare crisis. There's no military solution to almost every problem that we can name. And in fact, we can actually state the opposite, that we are in the dilemma that we're in because of the multiple wars that we have been fighting and losing ground on so many levels. The war on terror, the war on drugs, the war in Iraq, and now, if we're not careful, an escalating war in Afghanistan, which is known as the cemetery of empires. Now keep in mind that the United States literally lured the Soviet Union into the war with Afghanistan in an effort to bankrupt them. And it worked. And now we're doing the same thing, but we're doing it by choice. And keep in mind that in that war, we trained the Islamic fundamentalist extremists in an effort to defeat the Soviet Union, and now they turn their sights on us.